when I was in high school, I was the official projectionist, and here at Hoover High School in San Diego. And it was a Bell and Howell. So at 17, I graduated, and I was tired of school, so I joined the Navy. I had a hard time getting my parents to sign because I was 17.
You're underage.
Yeah. But anyhow, I make a long story short. I got into the Navy, and of course I went through 12 weeks of boot camp here in San Diego, and so forth. Got into aerial photography at Pensacola, and that was a 6-month. This was a 6-month course, you know.
So they were going to train you from the ground up, basically,
yeah,
on that.
Still aerial and so forth. So I was down there, and I was, you know, I guess maybe a seaman second class by the time I got to Pensacola. And I went to the movies one night. They were advertising for a projectionist. And so I got the idea of going to see the entertainment officer and applying for the job. I had never touched 35 millimeter film. It was only 16. And so I went to see him, and he said, "Oh, well, good." And I told him, I said, "You know, sure, I've run Simplex and Motiograph, and I was exaggerating. I won't say lying. I'll just say exaggerating." Anyhow, I said, "But I got to brush up. So if somebody's got some manuals on running these projectors, I'd like to study those manuals a little bit." And then I went out on training with an experienced projectionist. Anyhow, the great thing is that we used to have to do 4-hour watches, you know, and they took me off that. They paid me for for being a projectionist extra, and I never had a watch again at Pensacola.
By watch, you mean standing guard?
Yeah, 4 hours. 4 hours, and I usually used to pull like midnight to 4 a.m. or something like that. But anyhow, that's where I learned to really handle professional film, and I had that as a part of my education, and it was aerial photography, and it was being a projectionist and so forth that, you know, got me on the right track. Well, we did everything from, you know, we'd fly around in these SNJs, and we'd sit there and, you know, we'd bank, and we'd take pictures of this and pictures of that and so forth. And then, of course, we did mapping, where we got into into Beechcrafts. And we'd set the 18 by 18 camera, I forget the name, you know, mount it in the bottom of the plane, and we would navigate then, and we would do a lot of mapping and so forth. Yeah, we did everything, vectograph, 3D, and all kinds of things. It was fun. Anyhow, that's how I got into, you know, one thing led to another, and that's how I got into, you know, the movie business, and got started way back then.
Yeah, and I think you said after the service you came up to UCLA and took classes up there.
Oh yeah, right.
That, what were you specializing in? Was it optical work?
I was doing 3 things. I was taking classes in theater art at the Arts at that time. I was also teaching an instructor in UCLA Extension, and I was taking a lot of physics courses because I was so interested in it, particularly in optics and so forth. And I was there from 54 to 63. I mean, they called me the perennial student. But I got my PhD there. I made one visit to Bosch and Lomb, and it was back around 1963 or 64, and I made a trip around the world trying to find somebody to make the D150 Curvulon projection lenses, and ended up with Kollmorgen, giving the contract to Kollmorgen. But I went to Cook, and I went to to Japan and France, and looking for someone who would make those lenses, because they were, as you know, big and expensive.
Yeah.
But B&L, they had. See, this was too long after they were pretty popular, as you know, with CinemaScope and CinemaScope projection. And but by the time I came along in the early '60s, I don't think most people were not very interested in. But Kollmorgen was, and that's where I met Glenn Bergrund.
Ah.
That's cool.
Yeah, he was with Kollmorgen for a long time. I mean, he is kind of still, in the sense that Kollmorgen kind of morphed into ISCO, I guess.
ISCO grew out of Schneider. What is it? Schneider Company. It was brothers or something.
Oh.
We dealt with ISCO quite a bit, not quite so much Schneider, but with ISCO, and they would make special lenses for us and so forth.
How many basically total D150 screens ultimately were installed?
We had around 60 worldwide, and we even we helped build theaters like the one in Tokyo and the Marble Arch. I worked with the architects. Putnam was his name, for Rank, that built the Marble Arch, and that was built, from a lot of theaters were built from the ground up for D150. That's like at the Egyptian, when my boss said, we want to restore the theater and we want to put D150 in and so forth. I said, well, the very first thing we have to do is to build a new booth downstairs. We'll figure out how to do that, but I can't have the booth up on the roof.
Yeah, which it was.
Which it was.
Yeah.
Walk across in the rain to a projection booth.
It's always good for those prints, delivering prints in the rain. What was the first one completed? Was the Egyptian the first one?
First D150?
Yeah.
No, we built a theater from the ground up, a new UA theater at Lefrak City on Long Island. And it wasn't a huge theater, but it was built and designed from the beginning for D150. And that's where we had our East Coast demonstration of D150. And I would say that Lefrak Theater goes back to 1963, 1964. Yeah, that was the first.
And was that where you showed the Fortress of Peace to?
No, we didn't have it then. We took clips. We made a demo film with Todd-AO cameras and our D150 lenses, and then we also put clips in we call that the all-purpose theater. So we put clips in from My Fair Lady and from Sound of Music and Agony in the Ecstasy and so forth to show the 70 millimeter format, which was not 120 degrees as our theaters, as our D150 screen was, but yeah. The first D150 installation was at the Rosemary Theater at Pacific Ocean Park, which hadn't run a film in many, many years, and it was sitting there collecting dust, and so we made a deal to rent or lease the old Rosemary Theater at POP and put D-150 in there, and that's where we had the Academy and the ASC, and all of them would come down there, and we would have dinner and go over and look at D-150. Joe Kelly and I were really good friends, and of course he was working for United Artists.
Oh, right. Kelly of Kelmar.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, wasn't Andy Margolin and Joe Kelly from Kelmar?
Sure. There you go. Yeah. And of course Joe is retired. He's a little older than I am, and so forth. But his life, I did not envy his life, because you're talking about he would go into these theaters and convert them, and and all these UA theaters that we had. And
to make them for the D-150?
Well, make them, not only for D-150, but he was with them at the, installing a cinemascope and penthouses and so forth. And so he had, I think, 4 children, and he lived on Long Island and Glen Cove or something, but the poor guy was never home. I mean, he was in theaters, and his wife finally said, "Well, why don't you just, sleep in these theaters?"
Where have I heard that before?
So he finally reached a point where he got a staff together, and the staff went out, and he went out just the final day or days to approve them and so forth. But during the 60s and part of the 70s, he just traveled. The D-150 theaters, we put in 6 installations in Mexico, just as an example. We did the big theater in Tokyo and so forth. He was the guy that went out and rolled up his sleeves, and I'd come in and adjust the lenses the night before the premiere.
The tough work, the skilled work. You'd handle the skilled part, yes.